So it hurts me to draw an end to that little introduction. I could have, there it is again. I quite happily could have just listened to the whole album again, Chris. That, of course, was the first, I don't know, minute or so of Premonition, which is the single or the leading track from your fantastic new release, Big Finite Space. Really, really honored to have you here and to be speaking with you, Chris.
I appreciate you having me. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem at all. Obviously, a lot of people would know you from learning Modular. My first encounter with Chris Meyer was trying to get my Euclidean circles to clock properly from Pam's new workout. And you helped me with that not only once, but also the second time when I then subsequently forgot to do it, how to do it again. So that's the great thing about YouTube. You can find the things you've forgotten. But of course, then as I got to know you, I started looking at your creative works, and obviously you've done a fair bit. You know, outside of the technical education space in music technology and the philosophies around it, which I think you go into quite a lot as well. You've also had your 2001 release was Lucid Dreams. 20 years later, a little bit of a break there, Chris. We only came here to dream in 2021, and you've really ratcheted the speed of your releases up by in 2024, Finite Space. I did enjoy the previous releases. I think Finite Space is a big step forward as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
With what you've come out there. And people should know that that's going to be released on July the 5th, I believe.
Yes.
And it'll be on the normal sort of places like Bandcamp and so on. And you can even pre-order the album on Bandcamp now and get access to one of the tracks, I believe.
Yes. You can track to Premonition now, and then early June I'll be launching another track, Sputnik's Ghost, for people to preview until the album's actually out.
And for those people who do pay attention to Chris's Bandcamp and his Learning Modular Patreon posts, there are some videos of some of these tracks, but I got to say, the album versions are schmick. They're a different level. I think the video versions are really good to see how the man technically does the work, but the musical releases are how you enjoy it as a listener, and it does sound fantastic.
Yeah, and 3 of the 4 pieces on the album were actually live performances, and once I decided to make album versions of them, they get pulled back in, edited down, remixed, overdubbed, etc. So there is a bit of difference between the live videos and what's on the album.
Right. For a second then I interpreted you as saying that 3 of the 4 on the album were just live takes. And I was like, okay, I'm ending this interview now. I got nothing else to say. That's ridiculous. But no, that's fantastic. They are beautifully edited and put together, I guess, because it is completely seamless. So I guess, you know, in that 20 years, what were you doing? I know you were doing a lot of things in general, but creatively, you are a creative person, Chris. So what were you doing to express that creativity when you weren't sort of noticeably or publicly releasing musical material?
Yeah, I had started out in the music industry, you know, working for companies like Sequential Circuits and Roland R&D and things like that. And I was jamming with people in LA, and that's how the first Alias Zone album came out, is from those jams from people back in Los Angeles. But then I got a bit disillusioned with the music industry. Streaming was just starting to happen. No one was expecting to pay for music anymore. And it lost, frankly, my shirt on the first album. And meanwhile, our own business, my wife, Trish, and I, was evolving into doing video work. So I started doing a lot of video graphics for film, television, corporate events. And I ended up doing that for like 15, 20 years. So that's, why there's such a big gap in between albums is I left the music career behind and moved into a video and film oriented graphics career for a while. But when I got towards the end of that and started wrapping up that business, I started saying, what made me happy? Because working for Hollywood didn't. And it was mucking with sound. I said, okay, I need to get back into what I used to do and what I love to do and what I wanted to do since I was a kid. And that's to play around with synthesizers and to make music. And that's why Alias Zone got rebooted 20 years later.
Beautiful. No, that's extremely relatable. And yes, losing your shirt on the first album, I sort of understand that. I think I've still got 800 or so CDs of my release from back then in the garage. Not quite sure what to do with them because no one wants CDs.
I could go through the whole litany. Like I got a record deal. The record company didn't pay any royalties until 15 years later. I mean, it's the whole thing to disillusion you with the music industry.
Yeah, ouch. That is a bit painful. So let's talk about Alias Zone, the name itself. Where did that come from?
Yeah, where it came from was there was this band that's been actually going on for a long time, since the 60s, 70s, called Cosmic Debris. Richard Bugg was the head of that, and it's been through many, many different morphs and forms. And back in LA, Richard was doing a version of Cosmic Debris where he was trying to add a spoken word element to it. Things like slam poetry events, things like that were becoming really popular. And he wanted to see if he could mix that world in with the world of improvised music, jazz, and electronic music. And originally he asked me to join his group Cosmic Debris just to do samples and vocal drops. But the first gig I played with them, and every Cosmic Debris gig was improvised live in front of an audience, by the way. There was no studio work. It was all improvised, so you really get your chops there. They're fantastic jazz-oriented musicians with great chops, and they were using these boring drum machine patterns underneath this great music that they were playing. And I, at the time, was very heavily into looping already. And I said, I have much better rhythms than what you're playing. Forget me doing vocals. I'm going to become your drummer now. And I started doing percussion and rhythm loops and live hand percussion and ambient beds and sound effects and shortwave radio and all that jazz. And Richard's policy in Cosmic Debris was we were all equal partners in the band. So he recorded every performance to a digital multitrack, and he told all the members, you can have the multitracks and you can do whatever you want with them. So I picked the tracks that we had performed that I thought best reflected me and my aesthetic. And I said, I'd like to release these as an album. And I got permission from all the other band members to do that. And the question became what to name it. I said, well, this is kind of like an alias for Cosmic Debris. So let's call the band, or my version of it, Alias. Let's Google Alias to see who's called Alias. And there's this Canadian big hair hard rock band called Alias. I said, okay, I can't call it that.
No.
But I started exploring things. And I was very much into digital audio and music technology and things like that. And aliasing is a phenomena of digital audio where a ghost of the original harmonics appear inverted and shifted in frequency. And I thought that's a really interesting concept for what I'm doing in terms of trying to explore a ghosted version or an alternate version of reality in what I'm doing with the music. And I started studying and I read about the Alias Zone as that transition between reality and the ghost version of it. I said, that's a good name for a project. Let's call it that.
That's fantastic. I love the way it sort of references the primary or the original output, being the Cosmic Debris instrumentalists and whoever producing that material, and then you lifting it into an inversion. That makes a lot of sense to me. That's very cool. I love the title Finite Space, and I did think about quite a bit. I guess I wanted to get your take on sort of where that name came from. And also just to make the comment, obviously, that in electronic music, space and exploration and things like that have been a common theme, almost since the beginning of electronic music. There was a relationship between these voltage sounds with space travel or exploration and so on. And I guess from the title Finite Space, if the audience member, me, took it as meaning space, what are you trying to bring to that that's a little bit different to maybe what's come before?
Yeah,
that was a very long question.
Yeah, there's two versions of where the title of the album came from. One's an inside joke. And you mentioned how space music is a well-recognized genre inside electronic music that's been around since the early days of New Age and things like that. And a couple of albums ago, I was trying to get a label deal, and I submitted to one label, and he said, I thought you did space music. This isn't space music. So when I did an album, the current one, which I thought, well, this is the closest I'm going to get to space music, I had to reference that in the title just as a joke.
Yeah, yeah.
But the other thing is, I'm actually very disillusioned with our use of space. We were promised so much with the space race, and we had this romantic notion of what it was going to be like to explore all these other planets and all these other worlds, and where we're looking outward towards the infinity. And in reality, the way we're using space these days is very pointed inwards back to Earth. Either it's very simple telecommunication satellites and sending messages all over the world, and it's also being used to conduct war.
It's militarized. Yes.
Yeah, it got
our near
militarized.
orbit has been militarized. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of going from infinite space, which is what we're promised, is that instead we're fighting over the finite space back here on Earth instead of having that outward vision. And that's why I called it finite space instead, is I wanted to kind of say, look, this is not what we were promised. This is not how we should be conducting ourselves. And that's kind of like the underlying theme of the pieces, is the tensions of things like the Cold War, the hot war that's currently happening in Ukraine, etc.
Yes, we were promised jetpacks and they haven't arrived. At least my Amazon order is a little behind. No, that's incredibly deep and reflective, and I absolutely love it. I guess when I read the term finite space, I thought, well, even if there is a concept of infinity, of something being infinite, as human beings and with our capacities that we have, we're only ever going to experience that in our limited sense perception finite way too. So I guess I went to a bit more of a Descartesian angle on that one.
Well, it's a good direction to go, because infinity used to freak me out as a kid.
Yeah.
Where does infinity end? What's beyond infinity? Yeah. I just don't get this.
No.
And I've said later on in life, a lot of maturing for me is like learning how to stand next to the infinite and not get freaked out. How to realize that we're not in control of the world. It's infinitely complex.
Yeah.
Stop trying to think you can control or understand everything. Do what you can, but relax a little bit and move forward through it.
I love that. I might have to print it out, put it on the wall. But no, so the sound direction and the sound exploration and presentation on Finite Space is gorgeous. I guess I just wanted to talk a little bit about what hardware you chose to use this time around, and if it differed from the previous release, and what choices you made there.
Yeah, I know a lot of people associate me with being a so-called modular musician, whatever that means. And the modular synth is indeed my primary instrument. And the reason I'm attracted to modular synths is the opportunity to create new sounds every time you approach it. I'm very much into how do we get new sounds, new emotions, exploring that part of sound. But it's sound that I'm most interested in. I'm not in love necessarily with a modular. It's just my favorite way of producing sound. I also use field recordings. I play hand percussion, and I have a collection of other keyboard and desktop synths, all exploring different facets of, new sounds. So for me, a lot of it is trying to chase down new sounds, new timbres, putting together things people may not necessarily associate as belonging together. I tend to like a lot of what I call plucked and struck sounds. So you hear a lot of guitar and bell-like work in what I do. That's not all that common, I think. And a lot of people, they're very fascinated with, analog. We must, hew to this thing, or we're doing analog music with modular synths. And like, no, we're being creative. We're creating sound worlds. And I want to use whatever tools I have in my disposal to create these worlds.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. I want to just say the mix and the mastering of the version I've heard so far is just lovely. I've had it on a playlist, your album, with a couple of other albums I really like as well, and it sits in that playlist very nicely when your tracks start being played. So credit to whoever you're sort of working with on the mastering team there.
Yeah, actually, who I'm working with is a guy by the name of Howard Givens. He's the founder, one of the founders of Spotted Peccary Records, a label that does a lot of music in our particular genre, space electronic music.
Right. And
both he and the other electronic musician, Steve Roach, have been great mentors to me this last few years in helping me raise my game, because a lot of people that are friends and also role models like Steve Roach, Robert Rich, people like that, have been doing this for decades. And here I've decided to do it as I turned 60. So I've got a lot of catching up to do, and I've got a very steep learning curve I'm trying to go up right now. So like you say, listening in a playlist, I try not to listen to myself in isolation. I hold myself to standards of, I want to sound as rich and as complex and as polished as Tangerine Dream or Node or Redshift or all these other electronic ensembles I'm very fond of. The one thing I kind of get wrong is I don't realize that they are actually ensembles. They have several musicians, and I keep thinking I have to do that heavy of a sound with one person, which has proven to be a good challenge. But working with people like Howard Givens is what's really pushed me towards trying to refine my sound the best I can, get better at EQ, get better at mixing and stuff like that. And one of the things that changed on this album was I asked Howard and Steve after my last album, what am I missing still? What's the next thing I need to do to raise my game? And they both said, analog. You need to run stuff through an analog board. And I was like, oh, yeah, right. Yeah. We've heard all this analog stuff. But I went ahead and went out and got an SSL Big 6. A lot of people felt very strongly about it. And I did some blind tests where I took a lot of my different individual tracks and stems, ran it through a channel of the Big 6 with no EQ, no compression, just going through the mixer, back into the computer, and was literally doing blind tests where I closed my eyes, hit the switch button between using the Big 6 knot multiple times, so I lost where I was, and just kept switching back and forth until I said, okay, I prefer this version. And every time it was the version that went through the Big 6 mixer. I said, okay, maybe there is a little something to this analog fairy dust thing after all then. And that's one of the big differences in Finite Space is every single track was processed through the Big 6 after I was done recording it and working with it otherwise. Just trying to add a little bit of an analog sheen. The other thing that you asked about what's different in instrumentation, I've been playing live quite a bit the last few years. So that means a lot of the material I've had to release has been recorded with my small portable live system, which is a smaller modular case. It's just plugins for synths, things like that. And one difference on this album is that all the pieces were indeed done in my studio with the big modular, with my keyboards and my other synths and things like that. So the instrumentation is a bit different in terms of having a wider sound palette to play with.
Yeah, brilliant. I also, the SSL, the Big 6 does intrigue me a little. That does look like a gorgeous bit of hardware. It's got compressors, obviously, and a whole bunch of things in there that are going to help warm things up, I would imagine. So it's interesting to hear that feedback. I also read your Patreon article about the Sonar ID and the Sonar reference as well, where you got some value from that in the mixing process, I imagine.
Yeah, during the mastering process, I would run into a lot of problems with my mastering engineer, Howard Givens, where he and I weren't hearing things the same way. And he would do something and it would come back to me and I go, but that's changed that now. Now I've got to change the mix and all this jazz. And it was really kind of driving him crazy, to be honest. And we eventually realized, one, I was monitoring on ancient speakers. I was holding onto some Tannoy NFM8s that I've had for decades and was continuing to listen to those, and they were getting tired, to be honest. So I upgraded speakers. I'm using all Vocal stuff these days. And then the thing I did recently on this album was I got the Sound ID to go ahead and equalize the room, because the room that I'm in, is a converted spare bedroom like many of us, has mad crazy EQ, particularly in the bass region. If I move my head a foot, the bass changes several dB, and that's just not a good way to mix or create sounds.
No.
So equalizing the system also has now given me a clearer picture. This was the fastest turnaround I've ever done with Howard on the mastering, because he and I were hearing the same things at last. And a lot of people think, you don't need all that stuff. It helps,
You do. Yeah, I'm a fan of the Sonar ID product as well. I also in this room had a huge amount of bass end coming through, and I thought everything sounded fantastic. Oh my God, my kick's huge. And then I go listen to it in the car or out in the big hi-fi. I go, this is thin, this is small, this is not what I'm hearing in the room. And now the transition to other speakers is a lot closer and a lot more reliable. So yeah, it's a decent thing to look at if you're in a imperfect space, I guess.
Yeah,
finite or infinite.
I always had the philosophy that if you're going to do something and you want other people to pay attention or even spend money, heaven forbid, it's on you to do it to the best of your ability. I think it's honoring the audience to do things to the best of your ability. And that's kind of part of my pursuit of perfecting all the little pieces I have around me to get the most I can out of them. Because I figure if I want the audience to pay attention, I owe it to them to give them the best I can.
Yeah, lovely philosophy. And it certainly comes through. All right, let's talk a little bit about the tracks. We heard a little take from Premonition originally. One of the first things I scribbled down on my note paper about Premonition when I first listened to it was, wow, those bass frequencies are big, but they're tame. Like they're not rumbling. They're sitting very nicely there. So I guess that goes back to the upgraded speakers and the different things you've done to create that nice equalization. I think we sort of talked about that a bit. But as you said, throughout your time, you've used things like vocal samples or, slam poetry, you said, or shortwave. There are some really interesting vocal samples that really do add to the pieces for the entire album. Where did you get them and how did you sort of curate them into the pieces?
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'm going to go back a little bit to your previous question on bass and get onto the vocal
Sure.
stuff. Because actually,
absolutely.
Bass is something I work on quite a bit, to be honest. Because I used to be a bassist originally. That was my original act. So that, I was all about the low frequencies. Part of it is a trick in what I'm doing whenever I'm patching the modular synthesizer. Whenever I patch up a bass voice, I'm using multiple oscillators, and there's always a square wave an octave down underneath it to give it a really deep fundamental sound to it. And it's very easy when patching with a modular synth in particular to try to create this single sound that takes up the entire spectrum. But I come from a background of mixing. I used to do a lot of live sound mixing when I was young and things like that, of what was called frequency layering, giving each instrument its own space inside the frequency bands. So I do a lot of EQ and a lot of work with filters on the synths and things like that to restrict things inside their own spaces so they're not stomping on and competing with other things. And another thing you mentioned about bass and translating to different things, it's great to have a wonderful speaker system with the subwoofers and you hear this bass really great, and then someone listens on their laptop and the bass is gone.
Yep.
So another thing I've really focused on is like, what happens if they don't have a subwoofer? I'll boost a little bit of the second or third harmonic just to convey the bass, even if they're not hearing the fundamental frequency that's coming out of that square wave that's tuned down an octave. So bass is something I pay a lot of attention to. I try to create a really deep bass that's in there, but then play some tricks a little higher up so you can still hear it on other systems. So that's kind of important to me. Vocals, I love the voice. I love choir sounds. I love chants. I love interesting conversations. I love the sounds of different dialects and languages and things like that. But I also like storytelling, and that's a large part of it as well. So quite often, actually, it's fair to say that at least 3 of the 4 tracks on Finite Space, the ideas were triggered by sounds of people speaking and what they were saying. And I built pieces around that. This particular piece, during the space race, we had a very ill-fated Apollo mission called Apollo 13, where they went up and they had an oxygen tank explode on them due to some bad decisions. And it became a real challenge, like, how are we going to get these people back down to Earth, particularly without oxygen? So the voices you hear inside Finite Space are about the first half hour or so of the transmissions of Houston, we have a problem, where they just started noticing meters were fluctuating and things like that. And the live debug going back and forth between mission control and the astronauts, like, check this, I'm seeing gray flags on this signal, this voltage is measuring this, and they're trying to debug it as they go through it. And then the very ending is a comment that someone in mission control said, it's becoming obvious we have to look at an alternate mission. We've got a real problem here.
Oh, that sentence says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah. And for me, that's a real allegory for just, a lot of things, the space race, life, whatever you consider. You may have the best laid plans, but there will come a point where you go, okay, we're going to have to do something different now. So in this particular case, I took some of my favorite bits of that half hour of conversation and debugging, and I loaded snippets of it into a granular sample playback module. In this case, it's RBAR, which takes different snippets of it and plays it back in different pitches, in different locations, different snippets of it. Some of them are reversed. That's what sounds like a foreign language, or you can't understand what they're saying, are the ones being played backwards. Right. And I made a point of moving what the snippet was in each verse or chorus of the song. So when we go from the first verse to the first chorus, there's different samples. When we go to the second verse, there's different samples. And it's moving in a linear timeline until the very end of the piece, which is, we need to find an alternate mission. So that's where the voices came from on that.
I'm going to have to listen to it with that in mind now. So that's incredible, Chris. Thank you for that insight, because it did not sound at all accidental the way that was put together. It was very nicely done. It feels like there's a story being told, even though I didn't know what the story was. So my brain's just filling in the gaps. So that is quite amazing. Um, with regards to the sub bass, I guess something that a lot of us do is things like side chaining and so on to sort of create space within that. But in your sort of what you're doing, which is a bit more of a narrative of sound, what sort of things did you do to sort of create space for the other instruments, even though you've got this? It's like a blue whale swimming deep beneath everything, and it's there whether you can't do anything about it. It's great. But what did you do to sort of create the space there?
Well, particularly on this piece, a lot of it came down to really shortening the bass sounds and the envelope of the bass sounds. So they just came in and made little punctuations and stepped back, punctuations, step back. And I noticed during the intro, you're even doing a little bit of air bass guitar. The vision in my head for that was, I want to picture my old bassist in Cosmic Debris, Lucky Westfall, hunched over his P bass, playing out these little figures and improvising. That was the figure in my head that I was then trying to sequence and make the synthesizer sound like a human bassist, just playing these little comments, these little figures. So
that resonates because, yes, when I was listening, I noticed that you'd have the big bass sound here, and then there'd be another thing going on, but it wasn't the bass sound, but it implied the bass sound because they started at the same time, even though the envelope for the bass sound would have decayed at that point. That makes a load of sense. We're getting quite technical soon on here, which is good fun.
Well, it goes back and forth. With left and right brains working together.
Yeah, indeed. So I was wondering if you could just show us a little bit about the Ableton project, or your DAW project, as far as how you put that piece together, and we could just have a bit of a talk about some elements there.
Sure. I use Ableton Live as my DAW. I use this for my recording. I use it for live performance as well. It's my mixer. It's where all my effects are. So it's definitely the center of my life. And I've been using Ableton Live since version 1.0. I was doing loop-based composition before Ableton Live existed, just cutting up loops, putting them into a sampling drum machine, playing them back as sequences. And when Ableton Live came out, I said, man, this is the way I think. This is perfect. And I just had been with it on and off ever since version 1.0. So this is the project for Premonition. Let's go ahead and just show people the entire length of it here. And you can see in these different colors, the different colors on one different track are actually different takes. This is an unusual piece for me, that it wasn't performed live, or the bulk of it was not performed live. I actually built this one up track by track, which is the traditional way of doing it, but I haven't done it that way for a few decades. So it was an interesting exercise to not improvise. I'm used to improvising while playing, and then I record it and then pick the best take. And in this case, I had to actually think ahead of time how long each section was going to be and stuff like that. But part of what drove me to it also is I really wanted to change sounds from section to section. And it got to a point where it became too difficult to do it manually while I was playing.
Yeah.
So I had to do multiple takes here. And let's go and scroll down a little bit. So that's particularly why you see here, the pluck sounds are like on here, but then for the chorus, I had to drop down to an alternate take because I changed sounds there. Then for the next verse, I go back to this purple track here, which is a different sound on the synthesizer. And these gave me breaks to go ahead and repatch the modular during the choruses. So when we came back to the verse, the sound was different. And the same is going on with the bass here. And let me just go ahead and solo some of this stuff.
Sure.
So you can hear what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and solo the Rings group here, which is these set of tracks. And then you'll see as we go from like the green to the blue to the purple, and as you listen, you'll hear the patches change. I'll just jump a little bit ahead. When we come out of that section into the purple sections, now much more of a plucked string sort of sound. And I do a little bit of that with the bass as well. I'll go ahead and solo the bass group down here. As we go from like this pink section down here to this gold section to this blue section, I actually changed the envelopes and changed the filter setting a little bit on the bass just because I wanted it to feel a little bit different in the chorus sections. So let's go between those.
Ooh. Oh. Nice. I have questions.
but it's like one of the subtle things that don't hit you in the face, but I'm trying to keep interest in the song by not just changing the sound between sections, but as you might have heard from note to note, the sound's changing in addition to its pan position.
Indeed. So you've got the two rings instances there and the bass B down the bottom. What instrument is that?
That is a layer of a few different oscillators. And oddly enough, it was I mentioned before, I like vocal sounds, and part of my plan on this was to bring in as many vocal sounds as I could. So I used a few different oscillators, and we're going to get very technical again, but for the modular geeks, I used the Chaos Sophia, which is an alternate Vosim sort of wave shape, which I really like. I layered it with a Weissolator, an EXOS Weissolator, which can do vocal format sounds as well. But then I had to square away from my audio frequency generator an octave underneath, layered on with those sounds.
Okay, so lovely. Thank you for explaining that. I'm going to have to look at a few things. The other thing too is the way that you treat rings through this section and those melody parts is quite reminiscent of some of the post-rock stuff I listened to, like Mogwai, which I think everyone would have heard of, and also say This Is Your Captain Speaking Huera, an Australian sort of post-rock outfit. But and that way that the two different stringed instruments play against each other is very much reminiscent of that style, and I think it really comes together nicely. So yeah, nicely done there, Chris.
Yeah, I'm a real fan of the approach of Hocketing, where you have two different instruments trade off notes. And this was actually a trick done back in the Baroque era. And if you listen to some of Wendy Carlos's Baroque albums, like the Well-Tempered Synthesizer and even a little bit of the Switched on Bach, she's doing some of that Hocketing where she's going between different patches and alternate notes. So that's one thing I tried to do here was I had two rings going, and I used a module called an IntelliGel Shifty to trade notes between who is going to be playing which rings. And the two rings are tuned to different sounds. So it's alternating sounds. Those are
I've done that.
Go ahead. Yeah,
I've done that. Yeah, we're both doing that thing. I've done that similarly with my Twigs module, which is kind of like a branches, and then you run it out to do different, it's voices, but the triggers are split between whatever, and it's remarkably good fun.
And I know we're both fans of King Crimson, particularly the Adrian Belew era, and between Robert Fripp on a Les Paul and Adrian Belew on a Stratocaster doing those trading notes. It's that same sort of philosophy.
Yeah, brilliant. Really, really congratulate you on that piece. It comes together beautifully. And it's nice to isolate the parts, but I would encourage everyone to go out and listen to the whole piece because it's bigger than the sum of its parts. It's a beautiful thing. So yeah, very nice. I thought we could move on to Astray Window and have a little bit of a chat about that.
Yeah.
I love the title. Where did that come from? Because that's definitely not a space reference there, is it?
Unless there's
an ashtray floating in space. Oh, here we go. Here we go.
And it was inspired by the vocals that you hear inside this. The vocals are a shortwave radio transmission during the Cold War era. And it is a Czech military base called JSON, which translates to ash tree, trying to contact the Russian space communications facility called Okno, or window.
Oh, is that what she's saying? Right.
So she's saying, window, 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 this is ash tree, this is ash tree. Window, 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 this is ash tree, this is ash tree. And
oh my goodness.
And then the ending saying Kone is, and we should play some of the audio so people know what the hell we're talking about.
Yeah.
Is basically over or end of transmission. So that's where I came up with the idea of ash tree window, is taking the actual translations of the military bases that were communicating during that transmission.
Wow, that's remarkable. I had no idea that that's what's going on there. I thought might be you sitting looking out your window and doing the black and white filming of those weird critters that turn up in your backyard. So, bit of an inside joke there if you see Chris's social media. He lives in a very interesting place. So, yes. So the initial melodic theme has a kind of a cello-like sound to it. Was that your intention, or is that just me reading into the artist?
It was an indirect intention. You certainly got the source right. In this particular case, going back a little bit, Ash Tree Window is the first long form solo piece I've composed. Because normally I used to play with other musicians. I used to take the role of drummer with other people, and I would play a few solo pieces, but I wasn't particularly happy with them. But this was the first piece that I had to do all the parts myself, and I did it for a live stream called October Skies, which is supposed to be a space music stream. And I was like in my mind going like, well, what are things that I like from other songs, and how do I echo those elements in here? And in the case that opening melodic bass line, one of the Isao Tomata's, or Tomita, depending how you like to pronounce it, albums is the Firebird Suite. And in the opening of Stravinsky's Firebird Suite, Tomata is doing this really heavy face shifted boom, 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 boom. I said, oh, I have to get that feel somehow. And indeed, he was imitating very much an upright bass or cello sort of sound with it. So it was inspired by another electronic musician trying to imitate cellos or upright basses in a bowed sound. I said, I want to get some of that feel. And I purposely rounded off the attacks and things like that. And I can solo that for you if you like.
Yeah, beautiful. That's really interesting. I am familiar with the Stravinsky work you're talking about as well. So
yeah, so that was the inspiration. Obviously, the notes are not the same, but that's where it came from.
No, it's beautiful. Yeah. Oh.
And that's the case, again, where I'm layering different sounds, an analog oscillator and a digital wavetable oscillator, in this case, the Waldorf NW1. And one of my constant tricks is trying to make each individual note sound different to each other. So in this case, I use a module called a sample and hold quite often on different parameters, so that every note triggers a slightly different voltage that changes some parameter, like the wavetable that the digital oscillator is using. So that's why some notes seem to really pop out, where other ones are much more muted, is I'm constantly on every note changing envelope times or changing filter cutoffs or changing the waveform being used. So there's this traveling, evolving sort of feel to everything going on in the piece.
So one thing that I do when I'm listening to Ash Tree Window is I just focus on the bass line and I get my brain to follow along with that. And it's a really nice journey. I think just pointing out that it's not just the sound per note that is changing. It's the sound during the note, as you're saying. The envelopes are changing. The way a certain thing is happening changes. And it creates a much more human sounding approach using the electronic technology, I guess, which I found remarkable.
Yeah, I'm trying to make the machines sound a lot more human, because the machines do repetition really well.
Yeah. And
humans are a bit better at variations. And at an impressionable age, I was taken in by a benevolent tribe of jazz musicians. And they really educated me to improv, evolutions, changes, variations, things like that. And that's also heavily affects the type of music I compose.
Indeed. And also the actual sequence itself changes over time as well. Were you managing that as a composition, or were you letting modules kind of, because I know you do a lot of interesting things with marbles and things like that, but you were controlling that.
In this particular piece, yeah, I wanted very much different bass sounds for that intro piece and for the later section. And even though it's technically the same patch on the synthesizer, I had a pause between sections when I was performing it to go change some parameters and change the envelope and things like that to get a different sound between those two sections. And I'll go ahead and pull the project here and share that. So there's a section here called the bass sequence, and it's this gold into yellow into green parts down here. And each different color is an evolution of that particular bass line. But it was the same patch on the synthesizer. I was just changing its parameters when I could, like during my downtime in this section right through here. So with that bass solo, this is the initial bass sequence sound. then during this pause, while other parts were being faded up, etc., I was using my third or fourth hand. I don't know how many hands I used on this piece to go change some parameters, and then also change the sequence for the bass as well. And so it came back like this. So it's double time, sharper attack, shorter envelope, same underlying sound, but that's what's happening there. And,
Yep.
you know, it's really common in Berlin School of Electronic Music. Like early Tangerine Dream was another entity that I was channeling while composing this piece. They're known particularly around the Phaedra Rubicon era for their 4-note bass sequences. And I got to a certain point in the song about 13 minutes in where I go, you know, maybe I should change that up.
Yeah.
So I played around with the sequences. I said, well, what if I made the timing of the bass line have a different duration, different number of measures compared to what the rest of the piece had been doing to that point? And that's the transition you're going to see here in this yellow into green. And I'll go ahead and actually zoom in a little bit more so you can see what's happening here. So as I go from one section to another, you'll hear the bass line change. So it has a very different cadence to it, while the 8-note part that's playing on top of it is keeping the same sort of timing. And so the two together, the bass sequence and the higher melodic sequences sound like this, going between those two sections. And then a little bit later on in the piece, I switch back to the 4-note sequence, but cut it to halftime.
Yeah. We love delay trails.
Oh, yes.
No, that's a fantastic explanation. To me, that piece, because it starts and ends with the vocal sample, it's kind of like a cross-section of a moment in time, if you like. It's sort of like, for me at least, it feels like you're starting at a certain point and drifting up through different levels and then sort of descending back to it again. It's a really interesting 19-minute journey there.
Yeah, I really go for the big arc during the course of a piece, where I like to start low. It's kind of like an inverted symphonic form, where I start quiet, build up to the very busy middle, then go back to a quiet ending that usually recapitulates some form of the beginning. That's a common arc for me to do, because I want to take someone on a journey throughout the piece. I love transforms. I love repetitive stuff. I love just getting lost in the same floating environment for endless time. However, when it comes to playing music, I have a short attention span. So yeah. I want to throw in more changes rather than having something just be constantly the same throughout. So a lot of the composition comes from where my boredom threshold is, and saying, okay, I've heard that enough. This should change. And then introducing, even if it's just an octave shift on the plucked strings or whatever, just something to say, all right, we're going to change things up now. Keep your attention, wake up.
Yeah, beautiful. It's very nicely executed. I was going to ask you a question about the way you control the dynamics for these pieces. You know, do you sort of chart it out visually, or is it just sort of in your head as you go? But knowing that you sort of pull this together from start to finish from live performances, I guess kind of answers that. You must have the concept in your head of what's coming in where and all of that.
Yeah, a typical compositional arc for me is starting out with some basic melodic ideas or themes. I found when I'm doing visual art, it's very important for me to have a theme for each piece of art that I'm creating, because that helps you get over blank canvas syndrome. What should I do next? What shape should I put on the canvas? Yeah. What color should I put on the canvas? Well, if you have a storyline you're serving, then it makes sense to, well, what serves the story? So when I'm composing a piece, I'll start building up a collection of phrases or sequences against sequences or sounds against textures that I like. And once I build a large collection of these things, I start saying, okay, now I need to winnow them into a linear storyline. So I start taking all these individual sections and snippets and ideas and layers I've created and start saying, okay, let's start laying this out temporally to actually make it form an arc rather than being just a change. Here's another change, to try to make it flow and be part of the storytelling. So when I'm playing live, I have in my mind, there's these different signposts that I want to hit. When I'm inside one of those sections, I'll improvise inside that section. They'll change in length from night to night or from take to take. What I'm doing in terms of shifting things around and changing settings on the synths while I'm playing, the solo I'm playing on top, that'll change every take. But then I'll go, okay, boredom threshold kicking in, it's time to now move to the next section. So that I've got this new signpost to bring everything up, change presets, change sounds, and then start playing against that.
I think when I was playing my guitar, my boredom threshold was about 3 notes before I started playing something else. But it was progressive rock, so that was okay. But I'm being silly. But look, beautiful. I'd like to move on to Sputnik's Ghosts, please.
Certainly.
Which is track 3. And I found something interesting about that one because I thought, okay, I'm going to read up on the Sputnik situation and all that. Your piece runs for 22 minutes, and apparently Sputnik was in orbit for 22 days. So you could just, go all Illuminati and pretend you didn't know that, or,
Normally, I am highly intentional. Everything I do is for a reason. Yeah. That was an accident because the original Sputnik's Ghost was a half hour long. And it was created for another live performance, a live stream of Mountain Skies back in 2021. Yes. And we were all told to compose half-hour pieces. That's how long Sputnik's Ghosts were. But when I was editing this down to an album, I went back to my mentor, Howard Givens, and we're talking about the tracks. And I played him the tracks in their early live forms before I started editing, overdubbing, things like that. And he said, when you're playing live, it's easy to get into this space where everyone's there with you and they want to luxuriate inside that space. But when you're listening to an album, people aren't in that shared space anymore. It's just them hearing what's coming out of the speakers, and their boredom threshold is going to be different, and they're going to want changes to happen faster. So he's the one who encouraged me to go back into these half-hour jams I did. Ash Tree Window was well over 20 minutes initially as well, and to cut them down in time and make them a bit more concise and things like that. And it just so happens that it cut down to 22 minutes.
That's quite interesting. I thought, did he do this on purpose? I thought, wow, because if he did, that's like, it's next level. But no, it's a lovely piece of music. It's possibly my favorite. I don't know if, I think it might be my favorite track on the album, but it's hard to say that. It's possibly the one that I think less about musically and just kind of just go along with it, I think. So it's a really great track. I just wonder if you could pull up, there's a couple of points I found really interesting on this. One is the main melodic phrase, if we could just have a bit of a look at that. And the other is just focusing on your percussion a bit later on. So they're the two elements I'd like to look at in this track, please.
Yeah, certainly. And the percussion does have a story there as well.
Yeah, I'm sure.
This project has a few tracks to it. So you liked the melodic theme I brought in fairly early on. If I remember right, around the 4-minute mark or so.
I believe that was it. Yeah, it might have been a switching between things sound.
Yeah, what that was, I had several things going on in this track, and let's go ahead and just let's have a little bit of fun soloing some tracks.
Sure.
So there's this bass throb that goes on throughout the intro in particular. It's really heavy. And this is a common thing in my music. I love that big, heavy bass.
Yes.
With a complex envelope. And then there was these satellite beeps. They're supposed to be Sputnik's beeps.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm playing a little slow motion solo on top. And that's on the Hydrasynth in this case. But there came a time to make it a little bit more bouncy and interesting. And I was using a little instrument from the Czech Republic called the Vector synth. Yes. And it has a fantastic arpeggiator that can be programmed to randomly skip steps, randomly transpose them anywhere in 4 octaves. And the way it does vector synthesis is it really crossfades sounds over time. And that's this melodic part you hear coming in.
Ah, yes.
And we'll solo it down to just that part. So those who are not familiar with vector synthesis, this is something I created back in the 80s. And the idea was to have 4 sound sources that you could crossfade or mix between during the life of a note. Well, the folks behind the vector synth took that idea further and said, why do we have to do it per note? Why not go between 4 different sounds over time? So you can set up a path to go between 4 different corners, and it can take seconds or minutes to go along that path. So what you're hearing is, while it's playing notes, it's also slowly crossfading between 4 different sound sources.
I love this.
And back here we had the noisy part of the sound as well, which is one of my favorites. A really breathy sound.
Yes.
So that's it, crossfading to a different sound generator that just happens to be very noisy bass as opposed to very crystalline. And I like that evolution. It's an arpeggiator, which means it takes the notes you play and then repeats them. But its arpeggiator does some really fun things to randomize which octave each note is played each time through the arpeggio. And I'm also live entering different chords into it. That's the chord changes that you're hearing. Is in real time, I'm playing different chords to feed it these notes then to play with and generate.
That is one of the questions that was on my scribbling of paper was, how are you doing the transpositions here? Because I was trying to think about how I would do it using the tools that I've got, but you're actually doing a transposition by playing the key, and it's causing the vector synthesizer to, not the vector sequencer in this case, the vector synthesizer to transpose the arpeggiation. It's remarkable. And I think I could draw each point in space of those vector notes. You know what I mean? There's one here, there's one there. It has not just a left and a right. It has the 2-dimensional sort of, or even 3-dimensional placement in space, which is
it's a polyphonic instrument, and each voice it can randomly pan to different positions each note that it plays as well. Yeah. So that's where you get that very pointillistic. And that's one of the things I love about electronic music is you're not bound by reality. You know, normally in a band, that person's there, that instrument's there, that instrument's there. And something I play with a lot in my music is, no, that note's there, that note's there, that note is there, and moving things around.
It's absolutely a unique opportunity with electronic music. And I guess I focused on that but that motif because I don't hear things like that very often. So my ear automatically just jumped on it. So thanks for the explanation there.
Yeah, certainly. And there's parts later on when I'm also playing a solo on the hydrosynth on top of it, where I'm with 2 hands, like choosing different notes to play with the hydrosynth while also loading different notes into the arpeggiator to go ahead and play against it.
Oh, goodness me. The engineer at work. It's incredible. Now, I really want to talk about this percussion situation. If we could just play the whole mix through so that people get the context to start with for, 30 seconds or so.
When the percussion comes in? Yeah.
Yeah, that really interesting work you've done there. I just want people to understand why I got so excited about it. Yeah,
for those who are looking at the screen, these bottom 2 tracks are actually the percussion tracks. This light blue one here, and this one that goes between gold and purple. And we'll go ahead and play the whole mix of what I call the jazz club section of the song, because I want to try to evoke, again, being in a smoky jazz club. You've got a drummer over here, you got someone on a Rhodes piano over there, and then someone's singing, playing a slow melody on top of it all. And this is the build of when the percussion parts are coming in. That's the previous part fading out. We're moving into the next part.
Oh.
And I'll explain the bass later on. So there's a whole lot of percussion going on there in different forms.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
The first thing is I love percussion. When I was a bassist, I always worked really tightly with the drummer. I started doing hand drumming and hand percussion since then. And again, I'm very deeply inspired by people who do this wonderful clockwork sequencing from Tangerine Dream to Steve Roach today. But I wanted to do something a little bit different. So the way that I approach sequencing is I use rhythm pattern generators, things that are supposed to create drum patterns, and use those to step through my sequences. So rather than being it's following the kick of the kick triggers as opposed to a very even metronomic sound. So most of my sequences tend to be driven by, this one's driven by the kick drum pattern, this one's driven by the snare pattern, this one's driven by the hi-hat pattern. So they naturally interlock and trade back and forth like a kick and snare normally do, but they also have a bit of a feel to them as opposed to just being metronomic. And the other thing that I then do is I play with the parameters of the rhythm generator while that's going on. So you get these little variations. Like that bass line is a very simple repetitive bass line, but the timing keeps kind of shifting around of how it's going through the notes. And that's me playing around with the drum pattern of thinning it out, making it a little bit deeper, a little bit off kilter. Even though it's the same sequence being clocked, it's got this feel of, wait a second, that bassist is interpreting this different every measure. And that's intentional. Same with the Rhodes pattern as well.
Yes.
So those are the melodic patterns that are driven by drum patterns. So there's that sort of drumming to it. And then on the original live broadcast, I also had this metallic sound. So let's go ahead and play that by solo.
Sounds like Crucible.
Aha. So here early on, it's just some simple sounds. But later on in the piece, more sounds get introduced.
Nice.
So there's this sample library out there called Anti-Drum Machine.
Huh.
And their idea was they sampled a whole bunch of different metallics, booms, swishes, things like that, to try to create percussive events that didn't sound like drum machine sounds. And I picked one library that focused on the metallics. And then I used a melodic sequencer, the vector sequencer by 512, which both you and I use and love dearly. Which is
I've heard of that.
Yeah, a regular part of what we use here. That's sending notes to Anti-Drum Machine sample player, but each note is a different sound. So I start off by saying, just play these two notes, doot, 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 doot. But then the vector has this wonderful thing called chance operations, where you can say, well, when we come to this step, why don't we do a variation? Just 20% of the time, play a different note. So as the piece goes on, I'm cranking up the chance variations to start playing other notes rather than just the two alternating notes it starts with. So as it goes on, it's broadening its palette of what metallics get hit. And that entire pattern is being driven by a rhythm pattern module as well. So it's got a rhythm pattern, a drummer's pattern, going into melodic sequencer, playing initially two notes, then more and more notes, but those notes are different metallic samples. So that's the very busy hi-hat-ish part in this piece.
It's brilliant. And I guess in my brain, I thought it might be the WMD Crucible module because the metallic sounds in that are incredibly modulatable. But it makes more sense the way you said it because of it has a bit more discipline, I guess, in the way you presented the samples as they grow. That's amazing. I'm going to have to look up that sample library because I do love using percussion sounds that don't necessarily originate from the predictable places.
Yeah. And again, this whole thing of like, well, you're a modular musician. No, I'll use whatever tools I want. And if there's some interesting samples out there, I will use those. And this was, some metallics I really like. So that's what metallics are like.
I love that each hit has a different velocity.
Yes.
And also the delay signal is kind of integrating them all together.
Right.
It's nice.
So the original live performance piece had that part. And this was originally performed back in 2021. But as time's gone on, I've wanted to get more complex with my use of percussion and more drumming. And so a lot of the hand drums I play myself, although I'm not a really good player. For this part, I really heard tablas. I know tablas are not supposed to be part of space music, but that's what I heard. So I got this tabla library, a pair of them actually, and added that in for the album version. And then changes up a few places. You see each color in this bottom line is a different pattern actually, because I like things to change. And then I'll add the melody back in. So at the end of the day, there's really 4 different rhythm patterns doing different roles, from an actual tabla player to playing samples to playing melodic parts. And that's why it has this ensemble percussion feel to it, even though it's more melodic based music.
I think perhaps that's what triggers me so much on this track, is that interlocking timings and things like that, because I'm a huge fan of that too. As for the reasons we mentioned before, the early Crimson stuff or the mid-era Crimson stuff, things like the Mahavishnu Orchestra, the things they did, that really appeals to me. And this is completely different to those, but I can see the lineage,
And it was really fun to play games, like to juxtapose the very metronomic satellite beep with the very humanistic tabla playing, which is like this section. So it's like a member of the Latin band counting it out on a cowbell while someone else. Yeah. We just saw a Latin jazz ensemble last night. That's why they came to mind. But you've been making all sorts of interesting faces and noises with the bass parts. So I have to talk about that as well.
Go for it.
I played a little game in that transition as well, because early on, and let's get out of all these solo pieces. Yeah, let's solo. I have the bass throb going on early in the piece. And let's go ahead and solo that. And I wanted to transition from that to a bass part in what I call the jazz club section. But as you say, it's quite easy to have parts fighting each other. So my bass patch for the jazz club section, again, is multiple oscillators tuned differently, but I initially left the sub-octave out. And then as I manually faded out the bass throb, then I faded in the sub-octave on the sequence to replace the bass and come back in. So that's why, particularly if I solo just these bass parts, it's very high-pitched initially.
I see.
And let's bring in the throb. As I fade out the throb up here, I start fading up that sub-octave oscillator.
Lovely. There it is.
So that's another one of my sleight of hands I like to do, to not have things fight with each other, is I'm constantly cross-fading and fading bits and even oscillators in a patch in and out to stop them from fighting each other.
Lovely. Thank you so much for explaining that, because that's the thing for me as a writer that I need to do a bit more work with. So that's very inspirational.
Cool.
So that was Sputnik's Ghosts, plural. We now have Nightfall Kyiv, which I think takes you further into the benevolent jazz gypsies that kidnapped you as a child and then returned you to Roland. So that's interesting. I guess I just wanted to kick off with, because we've got we've got Sputnik's Ghost and Nightfall Kyiv, both with sort of Russian references. I guess to me it brings out the otherworldliness of it a little bit too. Because one, space is something, that we think about as, well, it's definitely otherworldly. That's exactly what it is. But also the otherness within our same planet, and I mean that as far as language goes, and words and the type of characters we use to write words. So automatically that brings a different sort of mysteriousness to it, which I thought was really cool. So I just wanted to focus on what hit me initially about this track. I'll say drew me in, not hit me actually. No, it drew me in was the flute performance at the beginning. How did you manage that? It sounds like you've gone and you've found some good flute player and said, "Hey, come to my house for the afternoon and record an amazing piece of improvised music," which that's what it feels like. It feels like someone in the room with you.
Well, it so happens that the flute part was indeed played by a flute player, a flautist.
Back in the Cosmic Debris thing?
Yes,
or...
Richard Budd is
yeah,
a flautist.
Yeah.
And
there you go.
And he plays these lovely processed flute sounds. And so when we played Back in the Debris, he always had that beautiful monophonic flute melody playing on top of our pieces. Now that I've moved out of California, I live in a different part of the U.S. in New Mexico. Still, every album I send one track back to Richard and say, play on top of this one. And I usually don't give him any more directions beyond that.
Sure.
And then several months later, usually I will get back multiple takes from him of him playing and improvising over the piece. And like, here, do with it as you will. And on each of the recent albums, you'll hear a track that has Richard on it, where I've taken his different performances and cut them up and done like that. And let's go ahead and let me bring up that piece. I can show you all the different little cuts of using Richard.
While you're doing that, does Richard also release his own music as well? Because I'd be tempted to check that out.
He still releases stuff. He still has material available as Cosmic Debris.
Yeah, right.
He's being pulled in two different directions. I'm trying to get him to release more stuff on Bandcamp these days to get more material out, since there's no longer these gatekeepers that there used to be to getting material out. On the other hand, he's had people come back and want to do vinyl re-releases of the old Cosmic Debris material. So he's kind of busy in that regard. So on this project, there's a series of tracks called the Flute Group, and it's basically the bottom third of the screen here. And there are three different takes from Richard. There's these green and yellow ones on the far left side. I'm moving my mouse around. That's just special effects he did, different breath tones, different harmonics, things like that, because I really love when he does that. Then the gold track underneath is him playing somewhat straight flute, mainly reverberated through an interesting space, and then through additional reverbs. So the gold is his flute dry, and then the pink section is his processed flute. He always gave me both of those. But then there's another take of him playing through a harmonizer. And I again have the dry flute.
Oh, right.
And then I have the processed flute, and he gave me all those to play with. And I had a lot of fun going back and forth and interweaving those different sections. So I'm going to solo him, and we're just going to go through some transitions in this area right here, where we're going back and forth between his straight flute and his harmonized flute. And there's different mixes going on to have fun with it and things like that. Let me back up a little bit here. And there's a reverb tail on that while other things are going on. And then we have him come back and do another statement here. And then a little further on their interleave too as we go between those sections. So that's an example of some of the different takes he gave me and the ability to go back and forth between them. And
so as an instrumentalist myself, I'm super impressed by his control of phrasing there. This is a person who has not just plugged their instrument into a delay or a phase or a harmonizer or whatever. there's someone who's incorporated those effects into the instrument as a whole and has obviously spent hours and hours and hours in the woodshed just getting the phrasing with those delay trails just perfectly done.
He likes to refer to his instrument as the hyperacoustic flute because he sees it as being an extended flute as opposed to just the flute instrument by itself. And we're talking about some of the early things. Here's some of the like breath statements he was doing early in the piece. I'm just going to back up a little bit here. We're just barely breathing into it.
Oh.
And those are not special effects other than echo. That's him controlling what he can do with the flute in terms of pulling out the harmonics and the breathy noises, things like that.
I think this pulled me in a bit because it reminded me of some of my favorite music, which was sort of Stephen Wilson's early Porcupine Tree around the Sky Moves Sideways era, where there was a bit of flute work, etc. I feel like this is almost a more jazz, or it's another extension of that. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I'm really happy. I always try to get him to play. And I've also have an album planned down the road where not only is he on one of the tracks, but also my bassist back then, Lucky Westfall, is also on one of the tracks. So that's going to be fun.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So, yeah, the one thing about this one that really got me was there's a percussive melodic sequence that draws lines across very long parts of this piece. I'm guessing that they're the rings and I'm just guessing that they're those possibly the rings and the pluck lines there. But the sequence, it's not like here's your sort of Berlin type electronic. Here's a sequence that just keeps going and going and going. Great, we're going to hit you over the head with some square and sine waves. It's a sequence that changes almost constantly over time. And I just want to know how you sort of made that happen.
Yeah, each section of the piece, because the bass line kind of changes throughout from being this really urgent 2-note sequence to something that I call a broken waltz, to something that's much more of a 4-note pounding sequence that then dissolves again at the end. Every time the bass sequence changed, I also was changing the melodic sequences on top of it. So there's different notes.
Could you just give us, sorry, Chris, could you just give us a bit of a listen to one of those sections so the people will know why I got so excited about it?
Yeah, let me go ahead and, well, sure, we can keep everybody in here rather than trying to pull out individual tracks. I'm just trying to figure out where the bass is and all this, because this is obviously one of the more complex tracks here with all these different layers in
Oh my goodness.
And I played this piece live throughout last year, by the way, just to give you an idea how crazy this is. But yes, let's get back to what you were asking with the bass lines. So there's him playing underneath. So that's like one of the early bass lines. And then we transition. I use gongs for transitions throughout this piece, and it'll go to a different bass line. That's just an urgent 2-note pattern.
Yep. And here we go. Yeah.
So obviously playing with live improv groups like Cosmic Debris, something I got really used to were people trading lines back and forth. As I do that quite a bit of my music, where I try to have 2 different patches that basically trade the lead back and forth between each other. And that's something I've been evolving. This is one of the, like this piece was composed in 2023, composed to Ash Tree Window, which was 2020, and Sputnik's Ghost, which was 2021. So you get a feel for how my composition process has evolved. But this is another case of, I had some simple sequences, 8 notes long. But on some of the notes, I had chance operations saying, This time play that an octave higher. This time play that a fourth lower. Just, half the time, third of the time, so that the sequences themselves are different each time through. And I'm triggering them with rhythm pattern generators again. And in this case, the ring sound is driven by the kick pattern. And then the yellow pattern here, the high-pitched Celeste type sound, is actually a sample library called Terracotta. And it's struck terracotta pots, but this is a heavily processed one where things are pitched up really high and harmonized to get that Celeste sort of sound. And that's driven by the snare pattern. So that's why that's on the backbeat compared to the ring stuff, which is, very much on the ones and on the foreground. So we'll go through another section here as they trade off, and you'll hear the rings, the pluck sound being pretty much on the beats, but then the terracotta, the high Celeste sound, being kind of more of a backbeat sound. So particularly with the terracotta sound, the Celeste sound, you can hear where it's in the holes in between the bass notes. And that's because the snare hits are usually on the offbeats compared to the dom, dom, dom of the sequence happening. So I have a lot of fun with that. And then throughout this piece, I'm also playing with the patterns themselves, how busy or how dense that they are. So I start with those really simple, doot, 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 just 2-note patterns per measure, but then start increasing the complexity more and more. And then eventually bring them both in at the same time and then build it even more complex when we get to craziness like this section. But you've got different frequencies where the bass is down here, the rings is in the middle, and then the Celeste type sound is up high. And that's, again, part of the layering process of trying to make it possible for you to follow each individual line as opposed to them stomping on each other.
Beautiful. Thank you. And the way you sort of build it and orchestrate the introduction of each of those things, that when it gets to that craziness, as you call it, it doesn't sound that way at all. It sounds like, well, here's naturally where it needed to go.
They're naturally getting busier. They've started with a very simple motif and they build on. And, for those who are into modules, that was rings versus a sample library terracotta. But later on, I used a layer of surface and pluck to get a slightly different pluck sound and do that against a sample library called circle bells. And they kind of trade off like this. Just because I'm an Italian, I use hand gestures. So what I'm doing live is I actually have 2 different sliders on a module where I'm controlling like a puppeteer. You play, now you play, now you play, now you both play together. You're busier, now you're busier. Okay, now you're silent. So I'm
lovely.
So I'm conducting the players basically with a couple of sliders throughout the piece.
Yes, I can imagine how you would be doing that. That's incredibly satisfying. So, and then something else that's been incredibly satisfying has been talking about all of these pieces of music, because I've been certainly getting ready over the last few weeks to have this conversation, and very much enjoying the album as well. So
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really, really appreciate you giving me an advanced listen and saying yes to this conversation as well. It's been really enlightening, and I hope for some people out there who are writing music or looking at different ways to write music, it provides a bit of inspiration from behind the curtain of an extremely polished, finished release. So,
thank you. I mean, in my case, I originally composed all these pieces to make music I want to listen to over and over again.
Yeah.
But if I succeed, I want to share it with other people. And I also have And I have a philosophy of a teacher that if I find something useful, maybe something else will find that useful as well. So that's why I also have a Patreon channel as well, Learning Modular on patreon.com, where every time I compose a piece of music that I think is worth sharing, I give a really detailed breakdown of like, here is what all the instruments, what all the patches are, and here's how I'm performing it, and here's all the details. Because I just, share with the subscribers on Patreon, this is my process. I'm not hiding behind something. It's not magic or it's not mystical. This is how my brain works and how these pieces get built up, and I hope other people find it useful.
Well, I think it's how we evolve the art form too, isn't it? Because we can just stay in our little studio spaces and be developing ourselves, or we can be sort of contributing to the collective consciousness, if you will, of people who are doing things all over the world. And there are so many great artists out there. And one thing I'd love to do is a bit more of this and talking to people about their process, because it's been incredibly enjoyable. So
I think it's great to learn what someone does and then make it your own. How do you evolve it and things like that? Again, one of my mentors is Steve Roach. I love his music. I don't think my music sounds like his, because I've taken some of the things he's taught me about his approaches to music, but then applied it to my particular taste. And what was maybe the same seed idea is now come out differently, just because I'm using it differently for my own pieces.
Yes, yeah, beautiful. So what's the timeline coming up to? What do you need to do to get the release sort of out there in June? And what are you sort of looking at? July rather, and July 5th. And what are you sort of doing leading up to the release? That's what I'm trying to ask between my stuttering. Yes,
yeah, that's okay. I'm trying to act more like a big real label, even though I'm still self-releasing this stuff. And it's very normal for your typical independent musician to say, oh, I've got something done. I'll put it on Bandcamp today. And I've been advised, that it's worth trying to build some excitement around a release. Particularly when you only do something every 20 years, which I did there at one point. With this piece, I've been trying to follow strategies other people telling me of, like, before it's ready to get out there, before you have CDs ready to send to people, release a single. Let people hear a taste of what it's like. A few weeks later, you don't have the CDs yet? Release another single so people get another taste of what it's like. And then eventually you're ready for the whole big release where the CDs get shipped out to everybody and all the tracks are available for streaming online and stuff like that. So that's been the philosophy I'm trying to carry more with this album, is like, rather than making it, okay, I did this album, plop, bye, I'm onto something else, is to spend more time enjoying this and luxuriating in it and sharing more of it, what's going on.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It gives you obviously a bit more opportunity to get the little social media, hey, I'm actually doing something. And maybe with the 3-second attention span that we all have these days, you catch the person on the right day and they click through and have a bit of a listen.
Well, social media is also an incredibly competitive thing. Like we've seen in our little niche of the world, how the different podcasters or YouTube stars compete to who's the first to have a video on a brand new instrument or a brand new module.
Yeah.
And I found it's the same in the music world, that people who have streaming music shows want to be first. And if you already have an album out, they go, well, that's already out. There's nothing new about that. And they're less interested, believe it or not, in playing it on their show because it's no longer fresh and new. And some of these people need up to 8 weeks lead time. So the business of doing music has definitely been encroaching on me more, this particular album release, because I'm trying to grow up and be a big boy and be a real artist. And, I'm having my fun encore career in my 60s of doing what I wanted to do as a kid and make music.
Well, I think the music deserves that extra bit of attention and care on the release. So all the best with that, Chris. And just reminding people that the best place to buy this from Chris, I believe, is Bandcamp, and the release is July the 5th. And I'd just like to say thanks very much for your time, Chris. It's been an enlightening and enjoyable conversation. I
really appreciate you being interested in the album and wanting to hear some details and share some of this with me. I've been having a lot of fun. I've got a string of new releases coming out over the next year. They're on the hard drives waiting for me to mix them down and get them out. And it's going to be a really fun future. Like the next album, I think is going to be a bit of a swerve for people. And the next album is going to be very much a dark ambient album, beatless, sequenceless out of me, with Robert Rich playing solos on top of everything. So that's going to be a very different thing from what people have heard from me before. And
that sounds lovely.
And then the album after that is going to go back to what people refer to as a tribal ambient style, where there's going to be a lot less of a space focus and much more of a world music focus.
Beautiful. Well, it seems like you have the template of a process down for delivering really good sounding material. So if you've got the material to feed into that process, there's nothing stopping you.
Yeah,
So,
it just
fantastic.
takes time.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yep.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Chris, and thanks anyone who's listening to this later on when we publish it. And get out there, get the album, and also check out the Learning Modular Patreon also, of course. But definitely listen to Finite Space. Beautiful material, beautiful album.
Thank you.